So thanks so much to all of our speakers. It's so fantastic to hear about all the different variety of work that's going on around Scotland, and especially to hear about how successful and enthusiastic the volunteers are in the south of Scotland as well. So now there's a chance for us to ask the speakers any questions. As Colin mentioned in his pre-recorded talk, he is unfortunately not able to make it today, but we can pass any questions on to him that you might have. So I'm just having a look at some of the questions that we've had that have come in. The first one is about the forestry grant scheme, and I'm wondering if Mac might be able to answer this on Colin's behalf, but if not, of course, we could ask him as well, which is the forestry grant scheme available in any other parts of Scotland, specifically Fife, but could be any other parts of Scotland in the Central Belt? Are there any plans to extend the scheme?
Yep, sure, I can try. I'm definitely not the expert. That is definitely a question for Colin, but we have worked quite a lot with the states to kind of help them onto the grant scheme and that sort of thing, so I do have a bit of insight. So the scheme is set up for grey squirrel control to benefit reds. So at the moment there's nothing in the Central Belt. One of the eligibility criteria is that you have to be in one of those key locations, and that's something that us as a project have been helping as well, and that's why we are quite closely interlinked, as Colin mentioned in his talk. In terms of the scheme moving forwards, I know next year there might be a little bit of a change as kind of our staffing structure and things for the project change a little bit too. But other than that, I'm not quite sure what it's going to be. I mean, there might be the potential for things to happen in areas where greys are becoming a nuisance just in their own right, as opposed to affecting red squirrels. It could be for forestry damage that I know a couple of people have mentioned. Definitely a question from Colin, but you can have a look on the publications area of our website for a bit more information about the forestry grant scheme, and that will share some links to other really useful bits on Scottish Forestry's site themselves too.
Fantastic, thanks, Mac. And yes, we can keep a record of these questions for Colin as well. So James, it was so great to hear about the trapline scheme in Aberdeen. It's so impressive what you guys have set up and are running up there. So we've got a couple of questions from people about that. The first is whether the scheme is available in any other parts of Scotland. And maybe as a secondary question, people are asking if they are allowed to do dispatch if they're already on the trapline scheme.
I mean, most people, I'll answer the second question first because it's easier. Most people, we mostly carry out the dispatch just because the type of trap that we use with the El Gecko trap, and also that in Aberdeen in general, there's not that many people that are kind of licensed, kind of when the air weapon licensing came in, there's not actually that many people with air weapons in Aberdeen that also have grey squirrels. And I mean, if somebody wanted to do their own dispatch, then obviously we would then be able to train them up. But the vast majority are fairly hands off. They're pretty welcoming. They want to have the trap. They want to see the whole kind of. Some people just host the trap, and then once they catch a squirrel, they cover it up, and then that's, as far as they're concerned, that's them. But there's other people who want to see the whole process through. So there's some people that will stand next to you and watch you dispatch the squirrel because they feel that they're obviously they want to be part of the whole process. The first part of the question, there is trap loan schemes that differ in many ways in the other regions. I know Tayside, they're kind of quite hot in their trap loan scheme, Argyll and Trossachs, and obviously the Red Squirrel networks down in the south. They you know, like just in general, just across the SSRS project regions, like without the buy-in of people hosting traps, we certainly wouldn't be where we are today. No chance.
I can chime in a little bit too if that helps for the other regions. So Aberdeen's in a really good situation that they do have this 24-hour call-out service, which is amazing, and I wish we had that in Argyll and Trossachs. Unfortunately, we don't. So a lot of the time we are dependent on either individual homeowners carrying out their own dispatch, and obviously we'll train them up, as James mentioned, but also we have volunteer dispatchers in key areas that can kind of act not quite on that kind of 24 hours a day, kind of having a team of 5 people, but it's one person that can maybe support individual homeowners in that area to do the dispatch if people don't want to. So there's a couple of different levels that you can get involved with, and then the same in Tayside, it's very similar to Argyll and Trossachs as well. And then obviously the volunteer groups in the south do a slightly different method as well.
Katie, could I just say something on behalf of...
Yes, of course, yeah.
If we just think about Lower Nithsdale, who have a veritable army of trap hosts, they're essentially loaning traps from the Lower Nithsdale group rather than from SSRS. There's a responsibility for doing this has been deferred, if you like, and will become permanent next March. And I believe that their trained trappers in that group are largely responsible for dispatch on behalf of those 50 trap loaners or trap hosts. And we have a small scale version of that in Gatehouse. Moffat also, as you heard from me, have a scheme of that sort. And I think in the vast majority of cases, the trained trappers and dispatchers are doing that work on behalf of the hosts. And of course, the labour saving part of this relationship is that the hosts look after the traps. They release the bycatch, red squirrels and other things. They keep the traps fed and generally maintain the situation and frequently look at them, which is the most important thing in terms of animal welfare, both for greys and reds. The quicker you can get to a trap and deal with either the bycatch or the grey squirrel, the better for all concerned, including the humans involved. It just makes sense to do everything as efficiently as possible, and this is a very good way of doing it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Mac and James as well. And I would just say that if you are watching this and you're not part of the trap loan scheme yet, and you are in one of the areas where we're actively working, Aberdeen, the Highland Line, or any of the parks in the south of Scotland, then to just get in touch directly with your region or with us, and we can forward you to the appropriate people looking after that area. So yeah, on the kind of trap loan theme, and I guess this could be a question to all. Have you received any public backlash from the trap loan scheme?
No. I mean, there is an anecdote that we did kind of go and put kind of information on the trap loan scheme in a local newsletter, and we had a small uptake of a couple of people. You know, they signed up to the trap loan scheme. The following quarter's newsletter, there was somebody that very, very much disagreed with the trap loan scheme and had written a letter to that same newsletter complaining about our trap loan scheme. And we had more people signing up with his negative review. We had more people signing up than our positive review the quarter before.
Yeah.
So
I'd second what James says. I mean, if people approach us, we'll put traps in their garden and they will monitor it for them, and then we will go in and do any dispatch that's required at the time, which, as Peter says, saves us a huge amount of time and effort with the monitoring that they do, saving us twice a day to check the traps. Very rarely have we had any adverse comments about it. Occasionally you get a neighbour, somebody in a neighbouring house who doesn't like the idea of their grey squirrel being removed. But we always work quietly. We don't make it obvious what we're doing. We put the traps in out of the way places, and we tend to remove the trap with the animal in it and dispatch elsewhere in those cases. But generally, we've had very, very little trouble with adverse reactions, and usually a huge amount of support from the general public.
Agree. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it can, obviously, like John said, it can be quite a kind of, there is householders that are a bit kind of nervous about what their neighbours would think, and they kind of want to do things on the quiet, and until they get the kind of confidence enough, and then even better if red squirrels start appearing in their neighbour's garden before, and then the next thing, their neighbour wants a trap, or somebody else down the road that they've been speaking to, and then it kind of snowballs from there. So that's when the scheme first started in Aberdeen. It was all through word of mouth. We didn't necessarily advertise it at all. It was all through word of mouth. People just reporting grey squirrels, and then through that, oh, would you host a trap? There's some people that just said straight away, not that keen, no way, blah blah blah, and that's their prerogative. That's fine. There's other people that were keen, and as the scheme kind of went along, the people that were less keen at the very beginning then came on board. But most of the time, when they realise we're an official run project, we're doing it for the benefit of the Reds. The majority of people just come on board, which is obviously without. Yeah, I'll reiterate again, without the members of the public, being so engaging, because it is a big step to be trapping a wild animal in your own garden. If you've been brought up in a town your whole life and you're not necessarily used to the kind of countryside or country ways or anything, to trap an animal in your garden is a bit of a big step, and for people to come on board so wholeheartedly is just amazing. And that probably goes like across all the regions.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and I think it's so great to see that once people see the benefits, that really then it kind of has a snowballing effect, and great to see that in the south of Scotland as well, these engagement activities like the calendars and promoting red squirrels, is something that will really help with that. So a question for Peter and for John, which has come in, which is, if somebody's interested, how can they get involved with joining their local volunteer group?
I pick that one up, Peter. The easiest way is if they're wondering where to contact us, if you go onto the forum website, or Saving Scotland's Red Sprite, the hub, there are details there of each of the groups throughout the areas and the area that they cover, with contact details there as well. That's the easiest way of actually contacting a group initially, if you don't know the contact details already. Once you contact a group, I can only talk for our group, but what we normally do is arrange to meet the new volunteer, usually go for a walk in the woods and show them exactly what we do and the different elements that we do, such as the various types of monitoring we do, and then talk through what we do when we find grey squirrels and the dispatch methods that can be used. And then we usually go quietly for a cup of coffee and just have a chat and see what they would like to be involved with, which elements they'd like to be involved with. Almost everyone is very happy to go for a walk in the woods and do monitoring and check feeder boxes. Not so many people are happy actually doing dispatch. But usually, or very often, we find that volunteers come in, they start with the monitoring, and then when they realise the full picture of the damage that the greys do, both to our reds, but also to the woodlands and everything else, then they start to undertake control. And it's a good way of introducing people into becoming controllers, rather than just expecting them to turn up at the door and take on control straight away. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Peter.
Yeah, I just say, yes, those kinds of volunteers are absolutely crucial, obviously, but to run a group, you need money, you need people to administer it, you need educators if you're going to do any kind of outreach with schools or other groups of youngsters, and you may want to have a substantial photography or video presence on the web, so you need those kinds of people to publicize what you're doing. So as I said in my talk, the network of groups in the south of Scotland has hundreds of volunteers with hundreds and hundreds of capabilities including all of those that John and I have mentioned and many others besides. And we're willing to entertain anybody to do anything. That's what volunteer groups are about. We're constantly on the lookout for opportunities to do new things, which may well require new kinds of volunteers to join individual groups because they simply don't have anybody with that particular skill set. So I think it's a very important aspect of our recruitment, is to pluralize it. And the other thing I would say about the maps on the two websites is that you can see a map of all the territories of all the groups, and you can blow those up to the extent that they turn into Ordnance Survey maps. So if you're particularly keen to see where your house is in relation to a group, or your favourite wood is if it's not near your house, you can easily see where your familiar territory is for your activities and your squirrel sightings in relation to groups. There are areas around here where you can actually stand on a point where 3 or even 4 group territories join. So you might want to join 4 groups as a result if you live there. That would be great.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that throughout South Scotland, it's a very underpopulated area. No group's ever going to have large numbers of people joining, especially doing practical conservation. And as a result, any new member, any new volunteer who comes forward is going to be welcomed with open arms.
16 minutes, starting now.
Fantastic, thanks both. Yeah, I think it's so great that there's such a kind of diversity of different opportunities and things that people could get involved with in the groups. And that's a good point about the maps. I know I've done that with my grandparents' house a couple of times just to see how many red squirrels are being sighted near where they live. So that's great. Thank you. We've got a really interesting question for Mac about Argotty, which is whether the grey carcasses from dispatch are ever fed to the red kites that have been introduced there.
Oh, yeah, big topic with the golden eagles down south as well. Yes, they are. And actually, our local volunteers also provide the grey squirrels up to Argotty as well. Just do something nice with them. And kind of give them a nicer end. And yeah, obviously it's helping the kites and it's helping that kind of local ecosystem as well. So
yeah, totally. And on the Argotty theme, do you know, I mean, you might not, but do you know whether there's been any analysis done of whether pine marten activity is having any effect in that part of Scotland? I guess that could be a question about that part of Scotland on a wider level, not just Argotty.
Yeah, so actually in the Argyll, Trossachs and Stirlingshire region, we have seen a lot of pine martens kind of move back into areas, kind of quite often alongside red squirrels moving back in as well. So we think that in areas where we have got a low density of greys, the pine martens are really helping keep that at bay, because especially when we saw the boom in populations in 2020, for instance, it didn't boom as much as we thought it would, and the greys didn't quite disperse as far as we thought they might do, because we didn't have much grey control happening, and we didn't have a member of staff in place to do that. We were all kind of locked away in our homes, and actually we think the pine martens probably helped with that. For Argotty specifically, Tom has been trying to get pine martens to come to the wildlife hides. He knows that they're on the estate. He occasionally gets them in some of the grey squirrel control traps, but they are evading him at the moment. He has put quite a lot of nest boxes up in the hope that they would kind of hang around a bit more in certain areas. Hasn't quite happened yet, but they're definitely there, and I'm sure they're helping, but there's no specific kind of research into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Yeah, I definitely would encourage anyone to check out Argotty. They've been doing such great work with lots of different species and have been in the news this week about their beaver release. So yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. So a question for John: how long did it take for your group to set up your very impressive level of volunteer operated grey control?
Basically from 2006 to now, I think. When the group first started, it was literally just 3 people who were keen to try and protect the red squirrels that we had in our reserve here. As I said earlier, we've got a relatively low population here, and it takes time to actually build a group up. I couldn't really give you a time scale. I mean, it's whenever a new volunteer comes forward, as I said before, we grab them with open arms, and we do all the, having worked very closely with precursors of Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels and Red Squirrels Northern England, who were terrific in their support in the early days of getting us started and getting the initial volunteers trained up in both survey methods and also undertaking control. We've for a long time now done our own in-house training, both for surveying, monitoring and control, with follow-up mentoring following the initial training until the volunteer is happy and we're happy for the volunteer to go out on their own. It's really, you can't really give a time scale, unfortunately, in these things. The group grows and has its own momentum. I would say that it seems to develop a bit of momentum after a little while, especially if you can start advertising the group within the area. But again, that has to be done carefully because you don't want adverse reactions from people who are against what you're actually trying to do.
Mhm.
Having said that, I would say that we've had tremendous support from everyone local in our area with the work that we're doing. And any anti things that we get tends to be with holiday makers coming in from other areas who don't fully understand the area and what we're attempting to achieve here.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's brilliant. Really interesting. And then we've had a comment for Peter, which is just to say that it's really great to see pine martens as part of the conservation effort in Dumfries and Galloway. And I wonder, Peter, if you want to expand at all upon the activities that you've sort of been starting to do with pine martens in your region.
Yes, I think we're a bit lucky here in Gatehouse in the sense that we're, so to speak, in terms of pine martens anywhere, we're a sort of stone's throw from the location of the reintroduction of pine martens into the Galloway Forest Park in 1981. It has taken them an immensely long time to escape from that gigantic forest, partly, I think, because it's not the greatest place to live if you're a pine marten. The biomass of prey is low, the diversity of prey is rather low. Because this is a production conifer forest, it's not the most biodiverse place in the area. But I like to think of them getting to the viaduct on the old railway at the top of the Fleet Valley, not very far from where I'm sitting now, seeing the promised land and coming hurtling down the valley into the beautiful old oak woodlands that we have in the Fleet Valley, including the Costrammon Wildlife Woodland, which is a SWT reserve. But it has to be said that those exact same woods, whilst being beautifully biodiverse and full of old trees for pine martens to enjoy, are also absolutely perfect for grey squirrels. Because they have hazel understory and they have oak trees, which are much beloved of grey squirrels. So I did like to think that the cavalry had arrived in time, to use my metaphor yet again, in the shape of pine martens coming down the Fleet Valley and helping us out. But recent events suggest that the grey squirrels are beginning to get ahead, and hence my desire to encourage pine martens as much as I can. And what I would say about that is that the offers by local landowners to host pine marten boxes came right out of the blue as far as I was concerned. I thought there might be a lot of reticence about that. We're probably a bit fortunate here in not having any big commercial game shoots, which might be a sticky wicket for such enterprises in other areas. But I think the enlightenment of the local landowners has been a tremendous privilege and pleasure to observe and to benefit from. And I really think, the pine marten group that's just getting going down here is going to pitch into the Fleet Valley and the wider area of the Stewartry and in Galloway with some enthusiasm and get lots of boxes up. And then I think there's going to be quite a meshing between members of squirrel groups and the Pine Marten volunteer force. And I know one or two of the red squirrel groups in Northern Ireland are actually called red squirrel and pine marten groups, and I can kind of see that happening in parts of Scotland in due course for the same reasons.
Brilliant, thanks Peter. Yeah, and if anybody wants to find out more about the relationship between pine martens and red and grey squirrels, our staff member Emma Sheehy did a talk on that yesterday, which you can watch back on this platform if you want to. So we've got lots of questions for Colin coming in, which we will pass on to him. There is one that I wonder if Mac, you might be able to answer, which is there another way to identify active squirrel drays that doesn't require a license or specialist input?
So you can just go for a walk and look up, essentially. They can be really, really hard to find. And also in terms of felling, it's better to know if they're active, and that's really hard to determine. You basically have to see a squirrel going into it. And then in red and grey overlap areas, again, you don't know which species are using it until you see that individual squirrel using it. So they can be quite tricky. There is quite a lot of resources in that through Scottish Forestry about how to look for drays in woodlands. So I'd suggest having a look at their website. But there's no kind of fantastic way of doing it. Basically, it's just looking up and looking really close to kind of the trunks of big trees, really high up, normally more than about 6 meters. The other thing to be careful of is actually that they can use hollows in trees as well, so you might not see a big mass on the outside. But yeah, no kind of hard and fast rules, but you wouldn't need a license because you're not really interfering, you're just looking. But again, if you are walking kind of even through public access ways, you do have to be careful about kind of landowners and that you're not kind of getting in the way of any felling operations and that sort of thing too.
The only thing I'd add to that is thermal imagers. If you use a thermal imager and find a dray, the heat source from any squirrels that are actually within that dray will show up very clearly using a thermal imager.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. Thanks both. Brilliant. So James, I was just wondering whether you could ask a question that has come in about what are the species you might get that are trapped in the trap loan traps, and additionally from me, I guess, what do you do about that if you catch, say, a red or pine marten?
With the way that the trap's designed, the way the El Gecko trap is designed to the smaller birds can go in and out without too much of a problem, without setting the trap off. So there is instances where reds will go in, and then it's just a case of you can either just open the trap door at the top, because it's a top entry trap with the shelter cage at the bottom. So actually, with the shelter cage at the bottom, it closes it. The exit door at the bottom is then obviously enclosed within the shelter cage. So you need to top release it. So it's a case of you either stand back and reset the trap and open it from the top end, and the squirrel will probably just shoot out. And if the squirrel's not the brightest, which they tend to be at times, you just take it off and you just lay the trap on its side, and then the squirrel will run out, no problem. With the reason why we went with the El Gecko trap for our trap loans was primarily because it limits the bycatch. So the only things that we tend to catch, I mean, you will get the occasional magpie or the occasional, like pigeon or a stock dove or something. But yeah, so more or less, you only get squirrels. And with the feeder being inside, it means that the feeder's fresh for, excuse me, the feed inside's fresh for a couple of weeks. And then it's just a case of the trap loan participant householder can just empty that feed out, and they can just top the bait up themselves, rather than obviously the normal kind of mesh, kind of mink trap type trap loans where you constantly either having to put a tray of food in or you're having to bait it up yourself, whereas everything's encased of the bird feeder, especially when we're trapping in gardens, because most grey squirrels know exactly what a bird feeder looks like.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. And yeah, we've got the Trapping and Tech workshop, which is taking place at 1 o'clock. So feel free to go along to that if you would like to find out more. So it's nearly lunchtime, so we might just finish, I think, on one final question, which again is for Peter and John, where I think we've got people that are interested in kind of joining the volunteer groups, perhaps watching and wondering what sort of time commitment they might need to set aside in order to get involved with one of the groups.
I would just say straight away, volunteers are volunteers. They don't do hours. We will accept whatever anybody is prepared to do in any sector of our activity. So there are absolutely no rules at all on that particular issue. Any help is very welcome. Some people are able and prepared and skilled sufficiently to give a great deal of time and energy to this role, and other people might just go and help us at a gala or a show a couple of times a year for a few hours, and both are equally welcome. We just need all the help we can get. As John has said, we live in relatively underpopulated parts of the country. There aren't that many people around, and the more people we can attract, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, I'd second that 100%.
Fantastic. Thanks both. Well, I think that's about all that we have time for. Thanks so much to everybody for submitting your questions, and thanks to the speakers this morning. It was so interesting. Apologies we haven't had time for all the questions. We'll put the ones for Colin to him, and you can also get in touch directly with our speakers on the platform as well via the speakers tab, so do feel free to do that. We'll have a break now for about an hour, and we will start the next session at 2 o'clock when we will be looking at the future of red squirrel conservation. And for those that have booked onto the Trapping and Tech workshop, this also starts at 1 p.m, so just use the links that you've been given separately. We hope that you enjoyed this morning's session, and we'll see everybody in an hour's time. Thank you.